You know what I did watch on the weekend, which was a lot of fun, was the Wham documentary on Netflix. And if anything, like it sent me on a 5-esque rabbit hole down the career of George Michael. Like, goddamn, what a talented individual that was. And when you watch this documentary, because my sister was a massive Wham fan, and I do remember the phenomenon of Wham, but my memory, they were just kind of like a British pop band that had done okay in the UK, but they were huge. Like I didn't realize they broke the States so heavily and, like this global sensation. Do you remember Wham?
Yeah. So I'm a little bit older than you, enough older than you that
the influence.
This was absolutely 100% in my hitting zone. So there was actually Joy FM, which is the LGBTQIA station. That's it. Oh, you know what? Anyway, Joy,
queer station.
The queer station Joy FM did their own documentary about George Michael and Wham around this documentary. It was like talking to people about it.
Can I get the podcast?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I assume it's available somewhere, but I was interviewed for that because this year in my show I have a big routine about George Michael in my stand-up show.
Oh, really?
Year. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Maybe I should see your show because I've really just loved revisiting all this, because I had sort of forgotten, like I was trying to explain to Jem when we were watching it that like Wham and George Michael was such a big part of my childhood because my sister was such a huge fan, and then I remember sort of Listening Without Prejudice was one of my favorite CDs, like when I was a teenager and stuff, but it wasn't rock and roll, so I hid it from a lot of my friends, even though I thought it was a great album, and then to kind of like just read about all the shit that he went through. Like I had no idea that it took him till 1998 to come out, and the way he came out was the most humiliating way possible with that incident in the public toilet.
So for people who have seen my show, they will know this, and I won't give away the bit, but like that's the story I tell. So I tell the story about the song Outside.
Well, I perfectly set it up with that.
Yeah. So I tell the story of the song Outside because like the story of that song, because that was his first big song after because he was publicly outed by the LAPD when they had trapped him. And so the whole point of the routine is we all know the worst part of that story and none of us know the best parts of the story. And I went down a George Michael rabbit hole during the COVID time. I find him a very comforting artist, and I've always...
Me too.
So I just have these tentpole moments that I really remember him being in and out of my life. So slap bang in the middle of me sort of like really getting into Countdown and music was Wham. So Wake Me Up Before You Go, Careless Whisper. I just remember every week after week, Careless Whisper was like the number one song on the charts, and it would be again, and it would be again. And like there was, all this speculation around George Michael not wanting to be photographed from different sides and all this blah, blah, blah.
I know all this shit. Yeah, I remember when Careless Whisper premiered on Hey Hey It's Saturday. Yeah. And Jock and Blackman talking over the top of this song. I'm like, shut the fuck up. And that 60 Minutes interview with Mike Monroe. And they showed the B-roll footage of him complaining about like what side he wanted to be photographed from, which felt like such a stitch up.
And obviously at the very heart of all this was the fact that this guy was like the poster boy for, like you said, teenage girls around the world. But like that wasn't really, the life that he wanted to be, but was in this industry where that was where the money was. Like that's what he was forced to be. He was forced to hide who he actually was. Like it was 25 years ago when he was busted in that toilet, and in some ways it's amazing how much has changed in those 25 years. That's the positive side of the story, because he was like that, that was news all around the world, and he was a joke all around the world. Like it was something that we all laughed at. When you look back on it, you just think he was one of the most creative artists of all time. And he had to go through all that publicly for what? For nothing. Anyway, the story of it's actually very positive. And once he was out and who he became, I think is absolutely glorious. But I'm like you. I followed that whole thing. Like Wham into his solo stuff. I love the fact that he always seemed to be wrestling with, like being a big star versus who he really wanted to be. Like his lyrics would always be about trying to break free of systems or being like caught for whatever reason. That I really liked that a lot. And then, Listen Without Prejudice came out. And I remember I was going away end of year 11 on, Lions Youth of the Year I was the Victorians Lions Youth of the Year, and all the state winners were doing like a little nerd tour around Australia to see Australia and speak at Lions clubs. And my girlfriend at the time, Beth English, wrote me a little note for each day. Like it was one of those things of when I was away.
Don't take my clothes out of the laundry.
You don't fuck anyone, right? You're dirty. But what? What are you saying? No, little like quotes and like little kind of, so it was meant to be every day I was away, I could open one of these things. And so many of them were George Michael lyrics. So you know that thing of like where your life tends to cement like your love for an artist, because not only do you like their work, but you associate it with these times in your life. And then during the pandemic, like just was like really like, I'm just going to learn everything I can about George Michael. I remember when he died and we were at our friend Lou's place and like, you know,
just after Christmas.
Yeah, just after Christmas, and everyone playing the music and sort of sharing memories. And so I ended up watching, like, there's a big live at London concert that's available on YouTube, and I watched all that. And just to see the joy he had, like, I mean, there's a moment in the concert, you know, where he's dressed as the sexy policeman singing outside, you know, and it's just glorious. Like he was amazing. What a incredible, because he would have been too one of those artists that just continued to make great music forever. Like you could tell that about the way his career progressed. He would have, you know, like, because he was always a bit loungy and jazzy, or could be at least, you know, as part of what his work is. So as an older artist, I would have loved to see what he did.
Well, people talk about like the evolution of the Beatles in that 7-year period. Like they went from being this pop, you know, boy band to being, you know, the greatest band of all time. But it was in such an accelerated period. And I didn't realize, for some reason, I thought Wham was around for longer. It was only 4 years, 82 to 86. And then he quickly went from Wham to Faith.
Yeah.
And then from Faith to Listen Without Prejudice. And if you follow the trajectory of those like 4 to 5 albums, that I think is equally as impressive in how his songwriting progressed. And have you seen the documentary?
I haven't seen it yet. No.
Oh, it's great. And the one thing I didn't realize was how early on in the process he was involved in the production. And there's this great anecdote where Careless Whisper was one of the first songs that they had written, Andrew and George had written, and they just kept it in their back pocket because they knew it was like this gold. And then when it finally came time to record it, they'd already had a bit of success with the first 2 albums. And so he'd flown out to New Orleans to work with this legendary producer who'd worked with like Aretha Franklin and James Brown, and recorded in the studio with all these legends. And, you know, they got the sax solo going. And then when he heard it, he was like, I don't like it. And he came back and plays it for Andrew. And they actually play it in the documentary. It's this kind of raw cut of the original recording of Careless Whisper. And it's just not magical. Like, it's fine, but he sounds tentative. It's overproduced. It feels like that American overproduced, just not what that song would be. And so Andrew and George talked about it, and George says, I reckon I could produce this myself. I think I know enough now. And Andrew's like, yeah, if I can go for it. And so every part of that song is George Michael. Like, he found the saxophone solo, went through like 6 saxophonists till they found the guy who could get that exact sound, the level of the production, everything about it is George. And when you think about that, then, like, you know, the Beatles had George Martin, but you've got this one songwriter who's coming up with the songs, writing them, but then also producing them. And there's just such a, like, I can't stop listening to Listen Without Prejudice now. Like, the last 3 days, it's all I've been listening to. And there's so much intricacy in the way, like, even the types of microphones he uses, like, everything is slightly distorted. He's obviously going as far away as he can from that really poppy, Faith, clean, shiny MTV sound to something that's just a bit, I don't know, more rough around, a bit more cynical. It feels a bit darker. It's just, it's amazing.
I mean, Freedom 90 is one of those like songs that just is so full of joy. But when you start to look at like some of his other songs, like Outside being one of them, but there was other songs that came along later in his career that just, the universality, like the fact that we as a world told him that he should be ashamed of who he was, and yet when he came out, like, or was forced to come out, but was then able to embrace being out, like, didn't lose a fan. Like, you know, I remember when I was DJing like weddings. Like George Michael songs were the most guaranteed to have everyone from the grandma to the, the teenage kids all dancing at the same time. It was genuinely universal music. It was the sort of music that your mum could like, but that your cool friends could like. And it's so rare that an artist is able to straddle that sort of mainstream but also critical line, right?
Well, it's funny. Well, because in Wham, that was almost the calculation was we are going to be just like, we are the antithesis to punk. The world needs brightness and fun and positivity. Like that is what that band was about, and probably why it was so successful, because they were this splash of color in quite a dark sort of music scene. But then the way not even 10 years later, he flips on his head with this really ponderous, cynical album of like, kind of some dancey sort of like, R&B tunes, but a lot of, like you say, jazzy kind of stuff, but with really complex lyrics and just this sense of melancholy through the album. Like, it's just amazing. I can't wait to watch it again. And Andrew Ridgeley too comes across as like just so honest about his place in the history of the band, but like no less essential. Like he says, George was clearly the better songwriter, and we had to have that meeting where George said, if we're going to get to where we want to get to, then I need to take charge and be credited for all the songs. And Andrew, like, just make sure we look cool and that everyone's happy. And like, I don't want to sound like a minimizing, because he did write some of the music, but essentially you had this incredibly creative but tortured guy. And then you had this dude who was just fun and light and laughter, and he was like, Andrew was more what Wham was. George was the talent, but then Andrew was everything else. It's just goes to show, Will, in a partnership, you don't need to be the most talented or famous one to be an essential member of the group. And I don't know who I'm referring to when I make that comparison.
I mean, now that you're in Torquay, like running your surf shop with you married a Gemma, of course, was in Bananarama. A lot of people don't know that. But
to see the full video, join our Patreon.
Patreon.com/Tofop.